Shalom, Gabe Greenberg here, Rabbi of Congregation Beth Israel in New Orleans, Louisiana, learning with you this week, as we do every week, the commentary of the Netziv on the weekly Torah portion. This week is Parshat Shlach. We are in Numbers, chapter 15, verses 38 and 39. This is the famous paragraph and passage having to do with Tzitzit, the placing of fringes on one's garments, famous because it was placed within the 3 paragraphs of the Shema that are recited daily by Jews all over the world for millennia at this point. The Netziv notes in verse 38 that the verse refers to 2 types of fringes, 2 types of strings: white fringes which come down on the corners, and then a blue thread which is wrapped around the white fringes and wrapped throughout. He notes first that these represent the sort of mundane. The white strings represent the mundane and the this-worldly, and the blue strings represent the godly and the upper regions, the spiritual. He takes off here on a well-known midrash that the blue of the techelet, the blue color, the deep blue, should remind one ultimately of the kisei hakavod, the heavenly throne. So with that as a background, he now moves into chapter 15, verse 39, and he notes that the verse says, Uzchartem et kol mitzvot Hashem, that the tzitzit should cause you to remember all of God's commandments. And then later in the same passage, it says a second time, Laman tizkaru va'asitem et kol mitzvotai, that this whole mitzvah, the commandment of tzitzit, is in order that you remember and will in fact do all of God's commandments. So the Netziv asks, he wants to put all this together and say, why are there 2 different colors, the white and the blue? Why does the passage twice say you should remember? Ha'inyan d'shtei zechirot halalu levan utchelet. He says the idea is that the 2 different times it says for us to remember correspond as well or parallel to the white and the blue. Ba'ot lishnei ofnei hanhagat ha'adam miYisrael. These 2 tracks correspond to 2 different types of 2 different ways that a Jew interacts with the world. Ha'echad mi shechayav b'derech hakvusha l'rabim. The first type of person or way of being in the world is someone whose life is totally given over to dealing with the public, to dealing with others. Osek b'inyanei parnasa, someone who's really involved in the material world with making money, running a business, making a living, providing for their family. Umikol makom alav lishmor lasot mitzvah bezmana. Such a person, despite the fact that they're totally wrapped up in other things, nevertheless have to make sure that they keep and do the commandments in the right time. That, for them, that's the white fringes that come out of the tzitzit, to remind them to do that. So that's the first type. Hasheni, the second type, mi shemufrash lavodat Hashem umit boded ushokea atzmo lahavat Hashem. Second type is a person who is totally separates themselves off and totally dedicates and devotes themselves to serving God. And they separate themselves and they totally sink in to this love and devotion to God. V'gam alav lishmor mitzvah bezmano. That person as well has to make sure to ensure that they keep the commandments in the right time as well. V'lo lekapeach maseh mitzvah bishvil dvekut chas v'shalom. And such a person shouldn't deprive themselves of the act of doing a mitzvah just because of their great devotion to God. It's counterintuitive. We might think that people who are so devoted to God, of course they're going to do the mitzvahs and the commandments. The Netziv points out that such a person might be so either lost or enraptured in a spiritual state, or perhaps he's saying that they don't think that they need to fulfill these sort of lowly commandments because they themselves have already reached such a plane of spirituality that they connect to God purely on that level, and they don't need to bother themselves with the commandments that the rest of the proletariat, the prole Jews, need to do. Ukvar Amru Chazal b'Masechet Shabbat. So he says this reminds us of a well-known midrashic statement in Tractate Shabbat. Godola hachnasat orchim yoter mekabalat b'nei shchina. That welcoming guests into your home is greater even than welcoming the face of, or the radiance of the Shekhinah, of the divine presence. And what's the example that the rabbis give? Shekain matzinu ba'avram avinu shamar lakadosh baruch hu al na ta'avor v'chulei. So the famous story in Parshat Lech Lecha, where, or excuse me, Parshat Vayera, the opening of Parshat Vayera, where Avraham greets these guests who come, these angels who pass by, and the Midrash says that he had been present with God at that moment, but when the guests come, Avraham says, "Excuse me, God," as it were, I have to greet these guests. Now, the Netziv said, "V'lo kivnu chazal she'amachnis oreach gadol b'mayla mimish zaka lahakbalat pnei shchina." It's not to say that someone who greets guests instead of sitting with the radiance of the divine that person is a better person. Because that's not what this verse is saying. Ela gadol lifnei Hashem lasod zeh mitzvah shel hachnasat orchim yoter mahakbalat pnei shchina. Rather, this is a sort of a bit of a metaphysical idea that in God's eyes, it is better to welcome guests than to welcome the radiance of the divine. Meaning, so what the Netziv is saying is, you might think, it might seem on the human level, that reaching a spiritual level such that you are just vibing out on God's radiance, that's the highest level, and once you've hit that, you don't have to do anything else. But in God's eyes, that level still has to be subservient to this worldly actions, including welcoming guests, which seems like it could be sort of a mundane, daily routine thing. You just have guests over. You welcome people into your home. But the Netziv says, no, to God, that is really a higher level. So he brings it fully back together. So someone who's reached such a high level of loving God and sitting with the presence of the divine, nevertheless, when a mitzvah comes before them, shel haknasat orchim, alav lahafsik devekuto, that person has to welcome in the guests, and they have to cease their high level, their devotional moment, and rather has to connect themselves to this commandment which has come into their hand, kamosha asa Avram Avinu, just like Avram did. And all the more so commandments that only they could do, and that someone else could not do. So this is true not just when it comes to welcoming guests like Avram Avinu did, but there's a whole array of mitzvahs, and especially ones that only you can do. You certainly would have to make sure you do them in the right time. So he's now given us these two typologies of ways of being in the world. One is that you're involved with this worldly things, and to such a person, the tzitzis come to remind you, make sure to stop and make sure to take time for mitzvahs. And this is really where the Netziv spent most of his time, is on the more counterintuitive example of someone who's really on a high spiritual plane. They might think that they don't need to, but the tzitzis, and especially the blue, the ptil tchelet, the blue cord of the tzitzis, tells that person that they too have to engage in the mitzvahs that when they come up. And it's for these two types of ways that Jews interact in the world that God commanded the two different remembrances and the two different types of fringes, white and blue. So a very beautiful insight into a very common mitzvah, that of both wearing the tzitzis and saying this passage during the Shema. Always a pleasure learning with you. More next week.